Thank you for your patience in waiting. Here is part 2. That night, Amara didn't sleep, not because of guilt, but because of craving. The kind that lived beneath her skin, the kind that didn't ask politely, it devoured. Eve had left her in that office breathless, trembling, undone, and then walked away like nothing had ever happened. No kiss, no comfort, no closure, just silence. Just the echo of her voice still caught in Amara's bones. I could make you come without even touching you. And she had, without laying a single hand. Now, every part of Amara felt like it belonged to someone else, like she was a song that only Eve knew the melody to, a prayer half whispered, a fire only half lit. The next morning, Amara stood outside of Eve's empty lecture hall. She didn't mean to be there. Her legs had taken her without permission, just like Eve had, just like she wanted to be taken again. The door was open, and Eve was inside. Eve didn't look surprised. She rarely did. Her gaze met Amara's like she'd been waiting for her, not expecting, inviting. Close the door, Eve said, voice low and velvet wrapped, and Amara obeyed. The lock clicked, and suddenly the world outside disappeared. Eve didn't rise from her chair. She watched Amara in silence, eyes tracing her with something between appraisal and possession. You've been thinking about me, she said. Not a question, a fact. Amara nodded, voice caught somewhere in her throat. Say it. I've been thinking about you. A breath. All this time. Eve's expression didn't change, but her fingers resting on her desk curled slightly. And what do you think about? Amira hesitated, but Eve leaned forward, elbows on the desk, chin resting on her laced fingers. A queen at court, a predator mid-hunt. Do you think about the way I spoke to you? Her voice dipped. The way I made you ache without lifting a finger? Amira swallowed hard. Yes. Eve stood, slow, elegant, intentional. She circled the desk, stopping just a breath away. I shouldn't have touched you, she murmured. Her eyes dropped to Amira's lips, her throat, lower. But I did. Her hand hovered at Amira's jaw, not touching, just close enough to feel. And I do it again. Amira's breath hitched. She didn't step back. She didn't speak. She just looked at Eve with wide eyes and a heart that was already surrendering. Look at you, Eve whispered, almost to herself. You came back, even after I left you shaking. She stepped even closer now, close enough that Amira had to tilt her head back. The power difference felt like gravity. Eve leaned in, her lips brushing the air just beside Amira's ear. Do you want me to ruin you again? Amira's breath left her in a single trembling exhale. Yes. But Eve didn't kiss her. She didn't claim her. She simply smiled, slow and dangerous, and said, Then come to me tonight, my place, midnight. And she walked away. leaving Amira standing there, heart pounding, legs weak, wondering how someone could break you open without ever laying a hand. Part 3. Midnight came like a secret, and Amira kept it. She stood outside Eve's apartment door, heart a storm, hands trembling. She didn't knock. She knew the door would be unlocked. When she stepped inside, it was like crossing into another world. Low candlelight, the scent of sandalwood and citrus, and danger. Music played somewhere soft, strings, slow and mournful. And Eve was waiting. She stood at the far end of the room, barefoot, hair loose, robe slightly open, just enough to hint at everything and reveal nothing. Still, watching, like she'd summoned her. "Close the door," she said. Amira obeyed. The click of the latch was louder than her heartbeat. "Undress." One word, no inflection. Amira hesitated just for a breath before she began. One sleeve, then the other. The sweater slipped off like a secret. Jeans peeled away, trembling fingers catching at the waistband. Her skin prickled in the candlelight, exposed, raw. When she was down to her underwear, she paused. Eve took a step forward, slow, controlled. All of it. Amira obeyed. She stood there, naked, soft, trembling, but not afraid. Seen. Eve moved in close, no rush, like every step was a lesson in patience. Like hunger didn't own her, she owned it. She didn't touch, she looked, from head to toe, eyes devouring, drinking in every shiver, every freckle, every inch of need. Then she leaned in, not to kiss, not yet, but to breathe her in, right at her neck. Just a soft inhale that dragged a moan out of Amira like a confession. "You smell like surrender," Eve murmured, and then, lower, closer. "You're already dripping for me." Eve dropped to her knees, but this wasn't submission. This was reverence. She kissed Amira's knee, then her hip, then the underside of her rib cage, soft, slow. Everywhere but where Amira ached for it the most. Amira was panting now, hands at her sides, twitching, too afraid to reach out. Eve's lips brushed the underside of her breast, just once, and Amira whimpered. "You're so ready," Eve whispered, "so desperate to be filled, and I haven't even touched you." And she leaned in again, so Amira could feel the whisper of her breath between her legs. "But I could make you come." Her voice was a thread pulling Amira apart, just like this. She didn't kiss her. She didn't touch her. She just stared at Amira's soaked thighs and the heat that glimmered in the candlelight, at the way her body betrayed her without shame, and Amira shook. Her knees buckled. Tears welled because Eve was right. She was coming undone without a single touch. I can't," Amira gasped, breath cracking, her hands balled into fists. I can't take it. Eve stood, cradled her face. Her thumbs wiped away the tears, soft, tender. Yes, you can, she whispered, because you want me to ruin you like this, gently, slowly, from the inside out. And then she kissed her, not on the mouth, but her forehead, then her temple, then her eyelids. You're shaking, Eve said softly. I don't know what I'm feeling, Amira whispered, but Eve did, because her own breath was starting to catch, her own control fraying. She leaned in again, closer this time, their mouths inches apart, breath to breath, but Eve didn't close the gap. Instead, she let her fingers trail down Amira's sides, not to arouse, to worship. She moved behind her, pressed their bodies together, bare skin to bare skin, and whispered in her ear, You want to fall apart for me? Amira nodded, tears still brimming from her eyes. Then show me. Let go. Amira's legs buckled, her breath caught, and she came. Without touch, without permission, just from Eve's voice, her presence, and her restraint. Her knees gave away, but Eve caught her, held her upright, kissed the top of her head, and whispered, Good girl. But Eve was trembling now too, because in that moment, watching Amira weep, undone by nothing but desire, something cracked inside of her. She hadn't meant to want her like this. She hadn't meant to be known. As if she stepped back, composing herself. When she stepped back, she realized Amira had seen her. She had seen it, the crack, the weakness, the ache in her restraint. And she moved without asking. One soft touch, that's all it took. Amira stepped forward, pressed her lips to Eve's collarbone and whispered, Let me. Eve should have stopped her. She should have pulled away, but she didn't. She let Amira kiss her there, once, twice, and then she went lower. Eve gasped just once, quietly. Her hands clenched at her sides, and then Amira took her, not with power, with reverence, with love. And Eve, she let her. She shattered silently, her body tensed, breath caught, eyes fluttered shut. And for once, it wasn't her orchestrating the ruin. It was Amira, and it wasn't part of the plan. Part 4. Eve had always prided herself on restraint, her rules, her control. No one touched her. Not really. She took. She led. She allowed herself to be adorned, feared, surrendered to, but never worshipped. Not like this. So when Amira sank to her knees in front of her, not commanded, not told, just moved by instinct, devotion, need, Eve should have stopped it, but she didn't. She stood there, breath held hostage in her throat as Amira's lips touched her skin like it was a prayer. The curve of her hip, the line of her waist, the kiss beneath her navel, not rushed, just reverent. In Eve's heart, God, her heart stuttered so hard she thought Amira might hear it. It had been years since anyone had been allowed this close. Years since she'd opened herself, her body, her soul, her thighs, and said nothing at all. No rules, no performance, just yes. And it was Amira. Of course it was Amira. Because she hadn't asked for permission, she earned it. Eve's knees almost gave when she felt warm breath against her skin. Her fingers twitched at her sides. She clenched her jaw, tried to hold the wall together, but it was too late. The kiss Amira pressed, lower now, wasn't a challenge. It was care. And that's what did it. It wasn't the heat. It wasn't the skill. It was the tenderness, the unbearable gentleness of it. The way Amira touched her like she wasn't trying to conquer her, but honor her. And Eve broke, not with a scream, not with a moan, but with a breath so shaky it rattled through her whole body. She grabbed the edge of the nearby table, eyes fluttering shut, lips parting in something dangerously close to a sob. No one's touched me like this, she thought. Not in years, not with this kind of intimacy, this kind of love. And then she came. Silently, devastatingly. Her hands curled around the wood, her spine arched ever so slightly. A soft, strangled gasp escaped her lips, and Amira looked up, lips still parted, eyes wide, and knew. Eve opened her eyes slowly, her chest heaving, the mask completely gone. There was no mistress in that moment, no predator, no queen on her throne, just a woman, undone and exposed. And when Amira rose, she didn't smirk, she didn't gloat. She reached up, cupped Eve's face in her hands like she was fragile, and whispered, "It's okay." And that was the final blow. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Eve stood still, stripped in every way. Amira's hands on her cheeks, their foreheads touching, breaths mingling. Eve's voice, when it came, was quiet, shaky, unrecognizable even to her. "I don't let people do that." "I know," Amira whispered. "I didn't plan." "I know." Eve's lips twitched, a sad, breathless, almost smile. "You caught me." Amira shook her head. "No." She leaned in, brushing a kiss over the corner of Eve's mouth. "You let me." That line hung in the air like a spell. You let me. Not just a statement, a truth, a choice. And for the first time in years, Eve let herself be held, fully, softly, without fear she'd crumble, because she already had. Amira pulled her down gently to the floor. They lay together, skin to skin, beneath the flickering candles, not tangled in lust, but in something far more intimate. Stillness. Eve's head on Amira's chest, Amira's hand stroking through Eve's hair. The roles forgotten, or maybe, finally, redefined. "You scare me," Eve whispered. "I scare myself," Amira replied. They didn't need to explain it. It was all there, beneath the silence. The tension, the sweetness, the breaking and the becoming. Eve turned her head slightly, pressing a kiss to the space just above Amira's heart. "You're dangerous," she murmured, and Amira, smiling, soft, safe, whispered back, "So are you." Eve woke before Amira. She always did. Control didn't rest. It watched. It listened. It anticipated. But this morning, she didn't move. She lay still in Amira's arms, Eve's face tucked in the warm curve of her neck, her breath syncing with the girl's heartbeat. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like the one in charge. She felt held, safe, exposed, dangerously seen, and it unsettled her more than any disobedience ever had. Amira stirred with a soft sigh, one arm tightening instinctively around Eve's waist. "You're awake," she murmured, eyes still closed. Eve said nothing. She didn't know how to explain the quiet quake in her chest. She didn't know how to name the emotion curling around her ribs like smoke. So she did what she always did. She tried to reclaim control. "You broke protocol," she said, voice low and measured. "You took what wasn't offered." Amira opened her eyes slowly, her gaze steady and warm. "No," she said gently, "I took what you needed." Eve flinched, not from the words, but from the truth in them. They sat up in silence, the sheets slipping down Eve's shoulder. Amira reached to fix it, and Eve caught her wrist, not roughly, but with the kind of grip that says, "Don't touch what you don't understand." Except Amira already did. Her eyes didn't drop. Her voice didn't tremble. "You don't scare me anymore," she whispered. And just like that, Eve's grip loosened. Her stomach tightened, because the first time in her life, she realized something brutal. Power isn't lost when someone stops fearing you. It's lost when someone starts loving you. Eve rose from the bed, slipping on her robe with a familiar precision, tying it tight like armor. But Amira watched her differently now. Not with awe, not with submission, with knowing. "I saw you last night," Amira said softly, legs curled beneath her on the bed. "Not just what you let me, but what you felt when I did it." Eve didn't respond. She moved to the window instead, staring out at the morning light like she could wash away what had happened. "I'm not here to take your control," Amira continued. "I'm here to hold it. When you're too tired, too scared, too human, that word, human, it sliced deeper than any lash." Eve turned slowly. She didn't speak, but her eyes said it all. "You're getting too close. You're breaking my rules. Don't." But Amira smiled, soft, brave, fucking lethal. "Let me take care of you," she whispered. Not a request, a challenge. Eve crossed the room faster than she meant to. She climbed back into bed over Amira, above her again, eyes sharp, posture tight, power slipping back into her limbs like a second skin. But something had changed. Amira didn't shrink beneath her. She reached up, brushed her fingers along Eve's jaw like she was taming a storm. And Eve leaned into it, I'm still your mistress, Eve said, her voice lower now, not a threat, a plea. Amira's smile deepened. And I'm still yours, she said. But don't forget, you're mine too. Eve's breath caught, because that was the shift. Not in dominance, not in control, but in devotion. It was no longer about who led. It was about who was willing to stay. When the mask fell, when the fire cooled, when the bruises faded. And for the first time in her life, Eve Harrington wasn't alone. Eve stood in front of the mirror watching herself button the last clasp of her bra. Black, lace, elegant. The robe she wore over it, silk, floor length, and regal. It didn't matter. Wasn't going into work yet. She needed to look like power again. Feel like it. Because inside, she was slipping. And Eve Harrington never slipped. She could still feel Amira's mouth from the night before. Not just the heat of it, the way it undid her, the way she let it, the way she came apart onto the lips of someone who had the nerve to love her. Eve pressed her fingers onto the edge of the dresser, hard, just to feel grounded again. Behind her, Amira stirred in the sheets, hair a mess, eyes still dreamy, skin still marked. Too soft, too intimate, too much. Eve turned, crossed the room, and climbed onto the bed, not gently. Amira gasped, blinking up at her, but didn't flinch. Eve straddled her, thighs pinning her hips. You think last night changed something, Eve said, voice low. Amira's lips parted. I think it revealed something. Wrong answer. Eve leaned down, pressing her palm flat between Amira's legs, over the sheets, over nothing, and smirked when she felt it. Already wet. Of course she was. Wrong, Eve said. It didn't reveal anything. You're mine. You've always been mine. You just forgot who's in control. She moved lower, didn't ask, didn't warn, just took. Amira withered between her as Eve tasted her like salvation and punishment. One hand locked around her thigh, the other on her own wrist to keep herself anchored. This wasn't tenderness. This was dominion. And Amira, she gave into it. Beautifully, wordlessly, like obedience was its own form of climax. When it was done, Eve sat up, face flushed, mouth damp, chest rising like she'd run a mile in heels. Amira was shaking beneath her, breathless, ruined, a smile tugging her lips like a secret. And Eve leaned close, her mouth brushing Amira's ears. Be on time for class today. She slid off the bed, adjusted her robe, turned back at the door, and wear the black slip. No bra. I'll know if you disobey.